Imagine booking what looks like the perfect getaway, a charming cabin nestled in the woods, a stylish loft in the heart of a bustling city, or maybe a historic home with a story to tell. You arrive tired from travel, eager to unwind, and ready to make some memories. But what happens when the key turns in the lock and you step inside only to realize something is deeply, unsettlingly wrong? From secret rooms that aren't on the listing to hosts who watch a little too closely, and even properties that seem to come with permanent, uninvited guests, the world of short-term rentals holds more surprises than you might expect. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on 31 of the most bizarre, spine-tingling, and downright unbelievable Airbnb stories across the United States, tales that prove sometimes the real adventure begins after you check in. These aren't just minor inconveniences or overblown complaints about cleanliness. We're talking about encounters that blur the line between reality and nightmare, where travelers found themselves in situations straight out of a horror movie. Hidden cameras, unexplained noises in the night, properties with dark and disturbing histories. Each story we'll explore is stranger and more haunting than the last. And what's truly fascinating is how these experiences reveal the unexpected risks of modern travel, where a simple booking can plunge you into a mystery you never saw coming. So whether you're a frequent traveler, someone who loves a good strange story, or just curious about what really goes on behind closed doors, you're in the right place. Over the course of this journey, we'll count down the 31 most shocking Airbnb stories that have ever been reported, each one guaranteed to make you look twice at your next rental. Get comfortable, but maybe leave the lights on. What you're about to hear might just change how you travel forever. At number 31 on our list, we find ourselves in the quiet, rolling hills of Pennsylvania, where a couple booked what was advertised as a quaint and charming Victorian bed and breakfast. The photos showed intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and a beautiful wraparound porch. It seemed like the perfect romantic weekend escape. They arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, and were greeted by an elderly, soft-spoken host who gave them a brief tour before retiring to her own quarters on the first floor. Everything seemed normal, if a little overly quiet, as they carried their bags up to their designated room on the second floor. It was on their way up that they first noticed them. Lining the staircase walls and perched on small shelves in the hallway were dozens, perhaps even hundreds, of antique dolls. Their porcelain faces, frozen in perpetual smiles or blank stares, seemed to follow the couple as they passed. The host had briefly mentioned she was a collector, but this was something else entirely. It felt less like a hobby and more like an occupation of the entire upper floor. The couple tried to laugh it off, dismissing their unease as an overactive imagination spurred by the old home's creaks and groans. They settled into their room, which was thankfully doll-free, and attempted to get some sleep. But as the house settled for the night, the normal sounds of an old building gave way to something far more distinct and unsettling. The creaking of the floorboards in the hallway beyond their door had a rhythm to it, a light, skittering pattern that didn't sound like random settling. Then came the whispers, faint, high-pitched, and interspersed with what could only be described as soft, muffled giggles. Convinced it was just the wind or their host moving about, one of them cautiously cracked the door open to peek into the dark hallway. The sight that greeted them was nothing short of paralyzing. The dolls that had been neatly arranged on the hallway shelves were now turned at different angles, their glassy eyes all seemingly focused down the hall toward the closed door of the attic. The door, which they were certain had been firmly shut before, now stood slightly ajar, a sliver of profound darkness visible within. They quickly closed and locked their own door, their hearts pounding. For the next few hours, the sounds only intensified. The distinct sound of small, hard feet clacking against the hardwood floor echoed from the attic above them, accompanied by those same faint, gleeful whispers. It was the giggling that finally broke them, a clear, childish sound that seemed to come from just the other side of their door. They didn't wait for sunrise. Throwing their belongings into their bags, they fled down the stairs and out into the cold night air, not even stopping to explain to their confused host. They later described the experience not as a haunting in the traditional sense, but as a feeling of being unwelcome guests in a space that belonged entirely to something else, something that viewed their presence as an amusing intrusion. Number 30 on our list takes us from the realm of the paranormal to a very modern and invasive fear, proving that sometimes the most unsettling threats are entirely human. A family from San Diego booked a beachside condo in Southern California for a summer vacation. The property was pristine, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering stunning ocean views, and the host had near-perfect reviews praising the cleanliness and modern amenities. After a long day of travel and a splash in the surf, the parents were getting their two young children ready for bed in the second bedroom. The father, a somewhat tech-savvy IT manager, was attempting to connect his phone to the condo's Wi-Fi and noticed an unusual network name that didn't match the standard provider information. It was something obscure and technical, which immediately struck him as odd. His curiosity piqued. He began a casual, almost unconscious visual sweep of the room, his eyes passing over the typical fixtures: a flat-screen TV, a digital alarm clock, and a standard white smoke detector mounted centrally on the ceiling. It was the smoke detector that held his gaze, a tiny, almost imperceptible dark spot on its white plastic casing seemed out of place. Upon closer inspection, standing on a chair, he realized it wasn't a flaw in the plastic but a perfectly drilled pinhole. And when he angled his head just right, the faintest glint of glass was visible behind it. His blood ran cold. With a careful twist, he found the entire outer casing of the detector was fake, merely a shell that popped off easily in his hands. Behind it was not the internals of a safety device, but a high-resolution micro camera. Its lens pointed directly at the queen-sized bed and the ensuite bathroom door. A frantic search of the rest of the condo revealed a second identical device in the master bedroom's own smoke detector, ensuring coverage of the entire living space. The family was horrified, their vacation paradise instantly transformed into a scene of violation and fear. They immediately called the police. When officers arrived and confronted the host, who lived just a few blocks away, his reaction was not one of denial or shock, but of calm, unnerving justification. He admitted to installing the cameras without a hint of remorse, claiming it was a necessary security measure to protect his property from potential damage and to, as he put it, ensure the safety of his guests. He argued that by monitoring their activities, he could theoretically intervene if he saw anything dangerous occurring. The police were not swayed by his twisted logic. He was arrested on the spot for invasion of privacy and the illegal recording of individuals without their consent, which is a felony in California. For the family, the psychological damage was profound and lasting. They embarked on a lengthy civil lawsuit against the host, not just for the illegal recording, but for the severe emotional distress caused to both them and their children. The case became a local news sensation, serving as a chilling reminder to vacationers everywhere. It underscores a terrifying truth of the digital age. The most intimate moments of your life can become a spectacle for a stranger, and the devices meant to keep you safe can be perverted into tools of surveillance. This story isn't about a ghostly whisper or a creepy collectible. It's about a very real, very human violation, proving that the most frightening discoveries are often the ones that are deliberately, maliciously hidden. Moving from the sun-drenched deception of California to the industrial heartland of Ohio, our next story descends literally and figuratively into a much darker chapter of American history. A group of 6 friends, all history buffs, had booked a large, renovated factory loft in a Rust Belt city for a weekend reunion. The listing boasted of original industrial character and a unique blend of old and new, which was exactly what had drawn them in. The main living space was everything they had hoped for: towering ceilings with exposed steel beams, expansive windows, and beautifully refinished hardwood floors. It felt spacious, modern, and only faintly echoed its gritty past. The curiosity that would lead to their nightmare began innocently enough. While searching for extra blankets in a hallway closet, one of them noticed something peculiar: a small, almost invisible seam in the wallpapered wall at the back of the closet. It wasn't a straight line, but a rough, uneven crack. Pushing experimentally, they were shocked when a section of the wall, cleverly designed to look seamless, swung inward with a groan of protesting hinges. Revealed behind it was a narrow, steep staircase descending into utter blackness, a wave of damp, cold air rushing up to meet them. The smell was unmistakable: aged stone, wet earth, and something metallic like old iron. Armed with phone flashlights, 3 of them ventured down the crumbling stone steps, their beams cutting through a profound darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The basement they found was not part of the renovation. It was a perfectly preserved relic from another era. The walls were rough-hewn stone, weeping moisture, and the space was dominated by a single, horrifying feature: a rusted iron-barred cell, looking like something straight out of a period film. The heavy door, slightly ajar, was a grid of thick bars, and inside they could see ancient shackles bolted to the back wall, their chains pooled on the filthy stone floor. But it was the graffiti that truly froze their blood. Etched into the soft stone walls around the cell, both inside and out, were countless names, dates from the 1880s, and desperate, fading messages. Some were simple scratches, perhaps marking the days. Others were more chilling, phrases like "help me" and "no one hears," carved with a frantic, shaky hand. One of the friends, drawn by a macabre fascination, stepped inside the cell to get a closer look at the shackles. As he did, the heavy iron door suddenly slammed shut behind him with a deafening, final clang that echoed through the cavernous space. There was no wind, no draft, no one near it. The door was shut fast, the old latch mechanism seemingly rusted in place. The immediate panic of being physically locked in was quickly overshadowed by a far more terrifying sensation. It wasn't just the cold of the stone or the darkness. It was a sudden, overwhelming feeling of profound despair and oppression that seemed to press down on them from all sides. The friend inside the cell began to hyperventilate, not from claustrophobia, but from a crushing mental weight he described as pure hopelessness. The 2 outside frantically pulled at the door, their own feelings of dread mounting, a sense of being watched by unseen eyes from the shadows of the basement. They finally managed to wrench the stubborn door open, freeing their friend, who stumbled out pale and shaking. They fled upstairs, but the psychological shackles of that room refused to unlock. For the remainder of their stay, none of them could sleep. They each reported the same experience, the feeling of that crushing despair settling over them the moment they tried to rest, coupled with the auditory hallucination of faint, labored breathing and the soft, grating sound of metal dragging slowly across stone directly beneath the floor. Their investigation after checkout revealed the building had indeed been a sheriff's holding facility and makeshift prison in the late 19th century, a waiting room for convicted felons before their transfer to the state penitentiary. They had not just found a historical artifact, they had spent the night locked in a vortex of residual anguish, a place where terror and despair had been soaked into the very stones, waiting to ensnare the next curious visitors. Number 29 plunges us into the dense, evergreen forests of rural Oregon, where a secluded cabin promised the ultimate digital detox for a writer seeking solitude to finish his novel. The drive alone was an exercise in isolation, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then to a single dirt track that wound deep into the woods with no cell service for the final 45 minutes. When he finally arrived, the cabin itself was exactly as pictured, a rustic, frame structure with a chimney looking like something from a postcard. The first sign that his retreat might not be peaceful, however, came before he even stepped inside. tucked into the doorframe, almost hidden, was a small hand-carved symbol, a circle intersecting with a downward-pointing triangle. He dismissed it as quirky folk art, a remnant of the cabin's past owners. That dismissal grew harder to maintain once he entered. The interior was clean and functional, but it was adorned with an unsettling collection of artifacts. Hanging above the stone fireplace was a large, meticulously woven tapestry depicting that same cryptic symbol, but now surrounded by a complex series of runes and astrological signs. On the bookshelf, amidst a few classic novels, were several handmade journals filled not with writing, but with intricate, page-consuming drawings of the same geometric patterns and what looked like ritualistic calendars charting lunar cycles. The most disturbing find was in the main bedroom's closet. Pushed to the back behind a row of empty hangers were 3 heavy, dark-hooded robes made of a coarse, wool-like material. They were clearly not vintage clothing. They felt purpose-made, uniform, and eerily reminiscent of garments one might see in historical texts about secret societies. As dusk fell, the writer's unease solidified into genuine fear. Trying to focus on his work, he became acutely aware that the profound silence of the forest was being punctuated by something else. It was the occasional, unmistakable snap of a twig just outside the tree line, then a soft rustling of undergrowth that seemed to move around the perimeter of the property. Peering out into the deepening gloom, he saw them figures standing motionless between the trees. They were too far away to make out details, but their posture was deliberate and watchful. They weren't hikers, they were simply standing there, observing the cabin. As full darkness took hold, a faint, rhythmic chanting began to drift from the woods, a low, monotonous drone that was just loud enough to be heard through the windows. It was then that he noticed the soft glow of firelight flickering between the trees in the distance, suggesting a gathering point somewhere deeper in the forest. Terrified but refusing to succumb to panic, he barricaded the door and spent a sleepless night with all the lights on, listening to the sounds of movement and occasional chanting outside. At first light, the sounds ceased. He packed his car in a frantic rush and sped down the mountain road, not stopping until he had a full signal on his phone. A deep dive into local news archives and obscure online forums revealed the terrifying truth. The cabin was infamous in certain circles. It had been built decades earlier by the leader of a small, isolationist religious group that practiced esoteric rituals rooted in a blend of paganism and apocalyptic beliefs. While the group itself had officially disbanded after a brush with law enforcement over weapons charges, the land was still considered sacred by its remaining members, who were known to use the cabin for private ceremonies, and it was rumored to test the resolve of unbelievers who dared to rent it. The writer hadn't just booked a quiet cabin, he had inadvertently become an uninvited guest at a private vigil, his presence noted and monitored by watchers in the woods who saw his rental as a trespass on their hallowed ground. Number 28 brings us to the sweltering heat and humidity of central Florida, where a family was desperately seeking a pet-free sanctuary for a very specific reason. The mother had a severe, life-threatening allergy to cats, a fact that made their search for a vacation rental incredibly careful and deliberate. They meticulously combed through listings, bypassing any that mentioned pets or even the possibility of previous animal occupants. They finally settled on a seemingly perfect ranch-style home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The listing was explicitly marked pet-free and allergen-conscious, with the host assuring them in messages that no animal had ever set paw in the immaculate property. It was a promise that would prove to be catastrophically false. The first blow came the moment they opened the front door. A wall of odor hit them with physical force, a thick, eye-watering stench of ammonia so potent it made them immediately gag and retreat back to the fresh air. It was the unmistakable, overwhelming reek of cat urine, aged and deeply embedded. Assuming there must have been some terrible mistake, they contacted the host, who apologized profusely, blaming a last-minute cleaning oversight and promising a full refund if they could just air the place out for an hour. Desperate and with few other options in the peak season, they decided to try. They opened every window and door, but the smell wasn't just in the air, it was in the walls, the floors, the very fabric of the building. It was a permanent, suffocating presence. As they began a more thorough investigation, hoping to find the source of the odor to perhaps clean it themselves, they discovered the true horror of the situation. Pulling back the couch to look for stains, they found not a spot on the carpet, but a perfectly cut, cat-sized hole chewed through the drywall at the base of the living room wall. Shining a phone flashlight into the dark opening, the beam revealed a nightmarish network of tunnels. The interior walls of the home had been hollowed out into a labyrinthine system of passageways connecting one room to another. They found similar entry and exit holes hidden behind curtains, under beds, and inside closets, all lined with scratch marks and matted with cat hair. The family was in a state of shocked disgust, realizing they were standing in the epicenter of what could only be described as a massive, structural animal hoarding situation. Their quiet contemplation of this bizarre architecture was shattered by the sound of a key fumbling in the lock. The front door flew open and the host, a woman they had never met in person, stood there wild-eyed and disheveled. She ignored them completely, her focus entirely internal. She dropped to her knees in the middle of the living room, calling out in a frantic, sing-song voice, "Babies. Mommy's here, where are my sweet babies?" She then began crawling toward one of the wall holes, pleading for her children to come out. It became terrifyingly clear that the host was suffering from a profound psychological break. This wasn't her rental property. In her mind, it was her home and the sanctuary for what they later learned from a neighbor had been over 30 cats that were seized by animal control just weeks prior due to horrific living conditions. The woman had been ordered to professionally remediate the home but had evidently refused, instead listing it online in a state of denial, desperately hoping to find her missing cats in the walls whenever new guests arrived. The family grabbed their bags and fled, leaving the weeping host still on her knees, calling into the dark passages for pets that were long gone. For them, the terror wasn't supernatural. It was the deeply unsettling collision with a severe mental health crisis, a reminder that the walls of a rental can sometimes hide histories far more tragic and human than any ghost story. Number 27 transports us to the rolling, history-steeped landscape of Northern Virginia, where a couple booked a weekend at a charming bed and breakfast that proudly advertised its origins as an 18th century farmhouse. The inn was a picture of antebellum elegance, with wide plank pine floors that creaked with every step, original crystal chandeliers, and a massive stone hearth that served as the centerpiece of the common room. The current owners, a spry elderly couple, spoke with great pride about the building's role during the Civil War, noting it had served as a temporary field hospital for Confederate soldiers after a nearby skirmish. They shared these stories not as ghostly warnings, but as simple historical fact, adding a layer of solemn authenticity to the ambience. The guests, a pair of avid amateur photographers, were captivated by the property's character and spent much of their first evening capturing the play of light through the old glass windows and the deep shadows cast by the firelight. It was only later, while reviewing the dozens of shots on their camera, that they found something that made their blood run cold. One particular photo, taken in the common room just as dusk was settling outside, showed the empty wingback chair beside the fireplace. But the chair wasn't entirely empty. Sitting upright in it was the translucent, faintly shimmering figure of a young man. He was dressed in the unmistakable tattered gray wool of a Confederate uniform, his head bowed as if in exhaustion or prayer. One arm was cradled across his chest in a crude, blood-stained sling. The image was not a blur or a trick of the light. The details were chillingly clear, from the buttons on his jacket to the hollow look in his eyes, yet the entire figure was undeniably spectral, with the fireplace bricks visible straight through his torso. Shaken but determined to understand, they showed the photograph to their hosts the next morning. Instead of shock or disbelief, the innkeepers met the revelation with a sad, knowing nod. They confirmed that the soldier was a well-known presence, a permanent resident whom longtime staff referred to as Benjamin. According to the local law they recounted, Benjamin was a 19-year-old private who had been carried into the house with a grievous arm wound. He succumbed to infection and fever not long after, passing away in that very chair by the hearth, which offered the only warmth on a cold night. His spirit, they said, was not malevolent but lost, forever trapped in the final moments of his pain and confusion, seeking a comfort he never found in life. That night, the couple decided to keep a vigil in the common room, not with cameras this time, but simply to observe. For hours, the room was still and silent save for the crackling fire. Then, in the deepest part of the night, the temperature in their corner of the room abruptly plummeted, a cold so sharp and sudden it felt like a physical entity. At the same moment, a wave of profound sorrow seemed to wash over them, an emotional weight so heavy it was difficult to breathe. They heard it then, a soft, ragged sigh that seemed to originate from the empty wingback chair, a sound of pure exhaustion that carried across the centuries. They didn't need to see him again to know he was there. This encounter transcended a simple ghost sighting. It was a visceral, emotional connection to a tragic moment frozen in time, a haunting reminder that some echoes of the past are too powerful to ever fully fade away. Number 26 takes us to the heart of New York City, where a young professional secured what he thought was the deal of a lifetime. A sleek, modern studio apartment in a trendy part of Brooklyn for a price that was almost too good to be true. The host, a man named Mark, communicated entirely through the app, explaining in brief, efficient messages that he would be away on an extended business trip for the duration of the rental and that the guests would have the entire place to themselves. The check-in process was seamless, using a lockbox code, and the apartment itself was exactly as advertised, minimalist, clean, and stylish. Everything seemed perfect until the first night. It began with small, almost dismissible inconsistencies. A carton of milk in the otherwise empty fridge that the guest was certain he hadn't purchased. A jar of peanut butter that seemed to have less in it than the day before. He wrote it off as travel fatigue, misremembering his own actions, but then the sound started. Not the typical groans and hums of an old New York building, but the subtle, unmistakable signs of another presence, the quiet click of a latch engaging in the middle of the night. The faintest creak of a floorboard from the small, narrow hallway that led to a single, locked closet he had assumed was for storage. One morning, he woke to find a single, muddy footprint on the clean kitchen floor, pointing away from the entrance and toward that mysterious closet door. The terrifying climax came on the third night. Woken from a deep sleep by a primal sense of being watched, he forced his eyes open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the city lights filtering through the blinds. And there, silhouetted against the window, was a man. He was standing perfectly still at the foot of the bed, simply staring. Paralyzed with fear, the guest lay frozen, praying his breathing sounded like that of a deep sleeper. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned and soundlessly retreated from the bedroom. Summoning every ounce of courage, the guest crept out of bed and peered into the main living area. The figure was not heading for the front door. Instead, he watched in horror as the man opened the door to the small, supposedly locked closet and slipped inside, pulling it shut without a sound. The host had never left. He had been there the entire time, living in a secretly modified, cramped compartment within his own apartment, emerging under the cover of darkness. The young man didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone, locked himself in the bathroom, and made a frantic, whispered 911 call. Police arrived within minutes. When they forcibly opened the closet door, they found the host, Mark, inside a space just large enough for a small mattress, a bucket, and shelves stocked with water and snacks. His explanation was both bizarre and chilling. He admitted to conducting what he called a social experiment, a desire to observe how people behaved when they believed they were truly alone. He confessed to eating their food for sustenance and watching them sleep simply because, in his words, he found it interesting. This wasn't a simple case of a weird living arrangement. It was a profound and terrifying violation of privacy, a psychological game orchestrated by a host who treated his guests not as customers, but as unwitting subjects in his own disturbing study. Number 25 shifts our focus to the breathtaking yet isolating Rocky Mountains of Colorado, where a couple sought a winter weekend of skiing and cozy cabin relaxation. After a long drive up winding, snow-covered roads, they arrived at their secluded rental just as the last light was fading from the sky. The cabin was picturesque, a charming wooden structure nestled among towering pines with smoke curling from the chimney, a perfect scene of alpine serenity. Their excitement, however, evaporated the moment they pushed the heavy wooden door open. Instead of the expected scent of pine and wood smoke, the air was thick with a coppery, metallic odor that made their stomachs turn. The main living area was a scene of deliberate and horrific staging. In the center of the room, the rustic wool rug had been pushed aside, and on the exposed wooden floor beneath, a large, five-pointed star had been crudely drawn in a dark, congealing substance they feared was blood. At each point of the star, a thick black candle had been burned down to a stub, wax pooled and hardened around it. Scattered around the perimeter of the symbol were small, clean-picked bones, clearly animal, but that did little to lessen the visceral shock. The furniture had been arranged to form a circle around this central display, and the room was freezing cold, the fire in the hearth having long since died out. Trembling, the woman called the host's number listed on the app. After several rings, a man answered. She described the scene in a panicked, stammering voice, asking if there had been a break-in or some kind of terrible mistake. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed not by concern or alarm, but by a low, unnerving chuckle that grew into full, uproarious laughter. He finally caught his breath and, in a voice dripping with condescending amusement, said, "Oh, relax, will you? It's just a prank for the next guests." Me and my buddies thought it would be hilarious. Really sets the mood, doesn't it? The couple was speechless. This was far beyond a simple joke. It was a deeply disturbing violation that transformed a place of rest into a stage for someone else's grotesque idea of fun. The host's complete lack of remorse and his cavalier dismissal of their terror was perhaps more frightening than the scene itself. They refused to spend a single second in the cabin, immediately contacting airborne customer service from their car as they drove back down the mountain. To the company's credit, their reaction was swift and unequivocal. A representative expressing profound horror and apology processed a full refund within minutes and permanently banned the host from the platform. While the financial resolution was immediate, the psychological impact lingered. The experience left them questioning the very nature of the trust we place in strangers when we rent their homes, a reminder that a listing's photos can never reveal the true character of the person on the other end of the booking. Our journey takes a somber turn as we venture into the lush, bayou-adjacent landscape of southern Louisiana for story number 24. A family from the Midwest had booked a historic plantation-style guest house, eager to experience the region's unique culture and architecture. The main house was stunning, but their rental was a beautifully converted carriage house located a short walk behind it, surrounded by ancient, sprawling live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The property was serene, almost otherworldly in its beauty, and they quickly settled in. It was on their first evening, as the children played in the large backyard, that their youngest tripped over something half buried in the soft earth. Brushing away the leaves and moss, they uncovered not a root, but the faded, sunken corner of a small, weathered headstone. Their initial curiosity quickly turned to unease as they realized this was not a solitary marker. A more thorough search of the overgrown corner of the property, near a crumbling brick wall, revealed a small, forgotten family cemetery. There were about a dozen graves in total, their headstones leaning at precarious angles, the names and dates eroded by a century of humid air and relentless growth. The dates they could make out ranged from the late 1800s to the early 1920s. What truly unnerved them, however, was the state of the plots. Despite the clear neglect of the surrounding area, two of the graves were impeccably maintained. The grass around them was neatly trimmed, the stones themselves were clean, and each was adorned with a small, elegant vase holding a fresh bouquet of white lilies. The flowers showed no signs of wilting. They couldn't have been placed more than a day or two earlier. That night, the mother was woken by a profound sense of stillness, a silence so heavy it felt deliberate. Drawn to the window that looked out over the backyard, she saw a figure, illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. A woman dressed in a flowing, ankle-length white gown was standing motionless between the two well-kept graves. Her head was bowed, her hands clasped as if in prayer or profound grief. She remained there for several long minutes, a statue of sorrow, before seeming to dissolve into the thick evening mist. The witness was certain it was no living person. The apparition had an ethereal, weightless quality, and her sudden disappearance was utterly silent. Determined to understand, the family visited the local historical society the next day. The archivists were not surprised by their story. They pulled old ledgers and land records that confirmed the carriage house property had once been the designated burial ground for the enslaved people and later the freed servants who worked the main plantation. The two graves with the fresh flowers belonged to a young mother and her infant daughter, both of whom had tragically died in the influenza outbreak of 1919. According to town law, the woman's husband was so shattered by the loss that he devoted the rest of his life to tending their resting places. The family's discovery was not one of a malicious haunting, but of a timeless vigil. They had not stumbled upon a neglected relic. They had borne witness to a love so enduring it transcended death itself, a century-old promise of care still being kept by a grief-stricken spirit forever bound to the one she lost. Arriving at number 23, we find ourselves deep in the mist-shrouded forests of the Pacific Northwest, where a solo female traveler had booked a remote cabin outside of Olympia, Washington, for a week of hiking and solitude. The host, an older man named Robert who lived in the main house a quarter-mile down the road, was polite if a bit reserved during check-in, giving her a quick tour before leaving her with the keys. The cabin itself was cozy and charming, filled with handmade quilts and the scent of cedar. For the first few days, everything was idyllic. She spent her days exploring the trails and her evenings reading by the wood stove, thoroughly enjoying the peace and quiet. The first hint of something amiss was a sound she couldn't quite place, a faint, rhythmic creaking from above the main bedroom that occurred late at night, long after she had turned in. It wasn't the wind or the settling of an old building. It had the distinct pattern of a footstep. Dismissing it as her imagination, she tried to ignore it. But then she began to notice smaller things. A book on the nightstand would be at a slightly different angle in the morning. The shower curtain, which she always left open, would sometimes be partially closed. The feeling of being utterly alone began to curdle into a persistent, nagging sensation that she was, in fact, being watched. Her breaking point came when she discovered a small, discolored section of the ceiling in the bedroom closet. It was a nearly invisible square cut into the wood paneling, so seamless it was only noticeable because a sliver of light from the attic above shone through a crack one evening. Pushing on it, the panel swung upward on silent hinges, revealing a pull-down ladder. Her heart hammering in her chest, she climbed into the darkness above. What her phone flashlight revealed was not a storage space for holiday decorations, but a meticulously curated lair. The low-ceilinged attic room was lined with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of photographs pinned to the rafters, candid shots of her from the past 3 days. There she was, reading on the porch, cooking in the kitchen, even sleeping in the bed directly below. But the true horror was on a small desk in the center of the room. Neatly organized binders, each labeled with a year and a woman's name, contained page after page of handwritten journals. She pulled one at random and read entries detailing the daily routines, meals, clothing, and even the perceived emotional states of a guest from 2 years prior. Another binder contained printed email exchanges and social media profiles dug up from the internet. This was not a fleeting obsession. It was a systematic, years-long project of surveillance. In a moment of sheer terror, she heard the distinct sound of a car engine rumbling down the gravel driveway. Robert was back. She scrambled down the ladder, replaced the panel, and called 911 from the safety of the locked bathroom, whispering her situation to the dispatcher. Police arrived to find the host, Robert, calmly sitting on the front porch as if waiting for them. He offered no resistance, almost seeming relieved to be caught. His confession was chilling in its mundanity. He admitted to secretly observing his guests for over a decade, considering the cabin his window to the world. The attic was his sanctuary, a place where he could compile the intimate details of lives he felt too shy to ever join. For him, it was a harmless hobby. For the women he watched, it was a devastating violation that turned a safe haven into a gilded cage. Their most private moments transformed into pages in a stranger's twisted scrapbook. This story serves as a grim testament to the fact that the most dangerous secrets aren't always buried in the ground. Sometimes they are watching you from just overhead, waiting to be discovered. Leaving behind the psychological terror of the attic observer, our next story plunges us into a danger that is invisible, insidious, and terrifyingly real. For a young family traveling to Grand Rapids, Michigan for a wedding, their booked rental was not a remote cabin but a seemingly normal suburban split-level home. The photos showed a clean, if slightly dated, interior with a large backyard perfect for their 2 small children. They arrived late after a long drive, and the first thing the mother noticed upon walking in was a faint, damp odor, like that of a musty basement or wet laundry left in a machine too long. Tired and eager to get the kids to bed, they dismissed it, assuming the house had been closed up for a while and just needed to air out. The physical symptoms began the very next morning. The children woke up with inexplicable, blotchy red rashes on their arms and chests. The parents initially suspected a new detergent or perhaps something they had encountered at the park the day before. But then the mother developed a persistent, dry cough that felt like it was scratching at the very bottom of her lungs. By the second day, the father was experiencing throbbing sinus headaches and a dizzying feeling of vertigo every time he stood up. The baby, who had been crawling on the living room carpet, broke out in hives. Their idyllic weekend trip was rapidly descending into a medical mystery, with their temporary home feeling less like a shelter and more like the source of their illness. Driven by a growing sense of alarm, the father began his own investigation. He moved a large bookcase in the master bedroom to plug in a phone charger and froze. The entire section of wall behind it was a sprawling, monstrous patch of black and greenish mold, its tendrils creeping out from behind the baseboards like some alien fungus. Horrified, he checked elsewhere. A loose section of wallpaper in the bathroom peeled away to reveal another colony festering beneath. The final, chilling discovery was in the basement utility closet. A slow, hidden leak from a corroded pipe had been dripping inside the wall for what looked like months, perhaps years, creating the perfect dark, wet environment for toxic black mold to thrive unseen. They immediately contacted the host, presenting photo evidence and explaining their severe health reactions. The response was not one of concern or apology, but of defensive, angry denial. The host accused them of causing the damage themselves, of trying to scam him for a free stay, and of having overactive imaginations. He flatly refused to believe his property could be unsafe, insisting the family was being dramatic. Realizing they were getting nowhere, the parents made a decision that would ultimately shut the entire operation down. They called the local county health department. An inspector arrived within hours. His professional assessment was swift and unequivocal. Using a moisture meter and a borescope camera, he confirmed the mold was not superficial. It was growing inside the wall cavities, spreading its microscopic spores through the home's ventilation system every time the heat or air conditioning kicked on. The inspector condemned the property on the spot, posting bright orange, unfit for habitation, notices on every door and window. The host, who had arrived red-faced and shouting, was served with a stack of violations and orders for immediate, costly remediation. The family's nightmare was a stark reminder that the most frightening threats aren't always ghosts or stalkers. Sometimes they are the silent, creeping consequences of neglect, a hidden poison in the walls that preys on your health while a negligent host looks the other way. Number 22 on our list offers a bizarre departure from the horrors of neglect and intrusion, trading them for a deeply surreal experience that left its guests questioning their own grip on reality. A couple from Boston, looking for a quiet autumn weekend, booked a small, charming cottage in the rural countryside of Vermont. The listing photos showed a cozy, well-kept home with a stone fireplace and a view of the changing leaves, and it seemed like the perfect New England retreat. The first sign that this rental would be anything but ordinary came the moment they pulled into the gravel driveway. Parked beside the cottage was a car, but not just any car. It was a pristine, baby blue 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, its chrome gleaming as if it had just rolled off the assembly line. Their elderly host, a man who introduced himself as Arthur, emerged from the front door to greet them. He was dressed in impeccably clean, high-waisted brown trousers, suspenders, a crisp white shirt, and a newsboy cap. His speech was equally antiquated, peppered with phrases like swell, gee whiz, and don't that beat all. He spoke of current events as if President Eisenhower were still in office and referred to their smartphone as a fancy little radio. They initially wrote it off as a charming, if eccentric, bit of theater, perhaps a quirky hobby for a history enthusiast. But as Arthur gave them a tour, the sheer depth of the anachronism became overwhelming. The interior of the cottage was a perfectly preserved time capsule from the mid-20th century. There was no television, only a large console radio that was actually tuned to a station playing big band music and period-accurate commercials for products like Brill Cream and Lucky Strikes. The kitchen was a marvel of vintage engineering, featuring a humming, mint-green refrigerator with a rounded top, a gas stove with clunky chrome dials, and a working rotary dial telephone mounted on the wall. In the living room, neatly stacked copies of Life magazine from 1958 sat on the coffee table. Every single detail was meticulously curated, with not a single object out of place or period. There were no power strips, no modern appliances, no clues whatsoever that the world outside had progressed beyond 1960. The true psychological disorientation set in after Arthur left. Attempting to connect to the outside world, they found their phones had no service whatsoever, and a search for a Wi-Fi network yielded nothing. The radio, when scanned, only picked up that one old-time station, its signal crystal clear no matter how they adjusted the dial. The newspaper delivered to the doorstep the next morning was a replica of a 1959 edition of the local paper, complete with dated headlines and advertisements. It felt less like a themed rental and more like they had physically stepped into a bubble where time itself had stopped. Their interactions with Arthur over the weekend only deepened the eerie feeling. He would stop by each morning to deliver fresh milk in glass bottles, asking if they'd heard the latest about the space race or making concerned comments about those riots down south, referencing events from 6 decades prior. His performance was flawless, never breaking character, his eyes holding a genuine belief in the reality he was presenting. The couple found themselves unconsciously slipping into the era, their own speech slowing, their anxieties about modern life fading away, replaced by a strange, passive acceptance of their new old world. Leaving after their 2-night stay was a jarring experience. driving back down the wooded road, their phones suddenly pinged to life with a deluge of notifications, headlines, and emails from the present day. It felt like crashing back to Earth after a long, dreamlike voyage. They later tried to find information about the cottage or the host online but found nothing. The listing had vanished from the site, and searches for the address or Arthur's name yielded no results. They were left with only their photographs and a deeply unsettling question. Had they stayed in an elaborate, incredibly funded living museum, or had they, for one brief weekend, somehow actually crossed into a pocket of the past, becoming temporary guests in a world that refused to move forward? This story stands apart from the others. It wasn't a haunting of place, but a haunting of time, leaving its visitors with a profound and unshakable sense of temporal vertigo. Slithering out of the arid landscapes of West Texas, our 13th tale trades ghosts and psychological torment for a more primal, skin-crawling fear. A group of college friends had booked a sprawling ranch house for a long weekend, envisioning days filled with hiking and nights around a fire pit under the vast, starry desert sky. The property was exactly as advertised, remote, rustic, and surrounded by the beautiful, untamed beauty of the Chihuahuan Desert. The first night passed without incident, filled with laughter and the cheerful crackle of a bonfire. It was on the second morning that their vacation took a horrifying turn. One of the young women was the first to wake, her senses slowly registering a strange, dry rustling sound that seemed to be coming from the air vent on the floor near her bed. Assuming it was the hum of the air conditioning unit kicking on, she tried to ignore it and drift back to sleep, but the sound grew more persistent, a distinct scraping and sliding noise. She sat up, squinting in the early morning light, just in time to see a sleek, patterned head emerge from the metal slats of the vent, followed by several feet of coiled, muscular body. A sizable rat snake, non-venomous but undoubtedly real, was methodically extracting itself from the HVAC system and into her bedroom. Her scream woke the entire house, and the true scope of the nightmare was quickly revealed. It wasn't just one snake. As the friends gathered in a panic in the central hallway, they saw movement everywhere. Another serpent was lazily draped over the warm television set in the living room. A pair of garter snakes were intertwined on the cool tile of the kitchen floor. A long, slender racer was slithering with alarming speed from beneath the couch. They were emerging from every conceivable orifice of the house: floor vents, the gap beneath the fireplace, even a small hole where the plumbing entered the wall behind the washing machine. In a state of collective terror, they managed to corral over 20 individual snakes of various species into a large storage tub, all of them non-venomous but no less terrifying for their sudden, invasive presence. When they finally mustered the courage to call the host, her response was not one of shock or apology, but of casual, almost bored acknowledgement. "Oh, yeah," she said with a sigh, as if discussing a minor plumbing leak. That happens sometimes when the weather gets real hot or real cold. They come in from the desert looking for a comfortable spot. They're harmless, just toss them back outside. She explained that the property's foundation had settled over the decades, creating a network of cracks and passages that were impossible to fully seal against the determined local wildlife. For her, this was simply a fact of life on the ranch. For her guests, it was an unconscionable failure to disclose a known and recurring infestation that transformed a place of rest into a waking nightmare. The group cut their trip short, loading their car with a frantic urgency, their skin still crawling with the phantom sensation of scales. Beyond the immediate terror, the experience left them with a profound sense of violation. Their safe haven had been breached not by a single intruder, but by an entire ecosystem, and the host's blasé attitude suggested their comfort and safety were secondary to the inconveniences of rural property ownership. This story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the threat isn't a malicious person or a restless spirit, but the indifferent and relentless force of nature itself, finding a way in through the cracks we thought were sealed. Number 14 on our list offers a terrifying lesson in a danger you can't always see or smell until it's too late, proving that the most toxic remnants of a home's past can linger long after the people have gone. A couple from Phoenix was driving through the starkly beautiful desert of northern Nevada and decided to break up their long journey with a 2-night stay at a modest suburban rental home just outside of Reno. From the outside, the house was utterly unremarkable, a single-story, beige stucco home in a quiet, sun-baked neighborhood. The inside appeared clean, if a little worn, and they initially had no concerns beyond the slightly odd, sweet yet chemical odor that hung in the air. They assumed it was an overly powerful cleaning product or perhaps a plug-in air freshener, and decided to open a few windows to air the place out. The first signs that something was deeply wrong were subtle. The wife, who suffered from mild asthma, found herself needing her inhaler far more frequently than usual, her chest feeling tight and her throat scratchy after just a few hours inside. Her eyes began to water and feel irritated, as if she was standing in a room filled with fine dust. Then they started to notice the physical evidence. In the hallway bathroom, the porcelain of the bathtub and sink were marred by large, irregular stains of a dull orange and yellow-brown hue that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The stains seemed to be baked into the very surface of the porcelain, a permanent discoloration that felt out of place in an otherwise tidy home. The most damning clue was discovered in the hollow, metal ceiling light fixture in the kitchen. The husband, a tall man, was attempting to change a burnt-out bulb and unscrewed the frosted glass dome. As he did, a fine, off-white powder showered down onto his hands and the counter below. It wasn't dust, it had a crystalline, almost sugary texture. At that moment, the strange, sweet chemical smell seemed to intensify tenfold, emanating directly from this mysterious substance. A cold dread washed over them. This was no simple maintenance issue. Their minds, fueled by crime dramas and news reports, immediately went to the worst-case scenario. They grabbed their child, abandoned all their unpacked belongings, and drove straight to the nearest police station. They showed the officers photos of the stained tub and described the powder and the smell. The police's reaction was immediate and grave. 2 squad cars and a detective followed them back to the rental. The officers didn't even need to enter the house fully. One whiff from the doorway and a glance at the bathroom was enough for a veteran narcotics detective to confirm their worst fears. The home had been an active methamphetamine lab, likely for a significant period. The stains in the tub were from chemical reactions that had boiled over or been dumped, and the powder in the light fixture was toxic residue that had been vented into the attic and settled back down through fixtures. The sweet, pungent odor was the lingering scent of precursor chemicals that had soaked into the drywall, carpets, and insulation. The police explained that the toxins produced by a meth lab, including phosphine gas, mercury, lead, and volatile organic compounds, are incredibly potent and persist long after the lab is dismantled. These carcinogenic residues can absorb into every porous surface in a home, from the concrete slab to the ceiling, creating a permanent health hazard for anyone who lives there. Exposure can cause severe respiratory problems, neurological damage, skin rashes, and long-term cancer risks. The host, when confronted by police, claimed he had purchased the property at a foreclosure auction a year prior and had no knowledge of its history. This was a blatant lie, as a simple check of real estate records showed he had owned it for over 5 years. He was cited for numerous health code violations and reckless endangerment. For the couple, the resolution was a hollow victory. They had escaped immediate physical harm, but the psychological impact was profound. They had unknowingly exposed themselves, and most terrifyingly, their young child, to a known carcinogenic environment for nearly 24 hours. The experience left them with a pervasive anxiety about the invisible dangers that can lurk behind a fresh coat of paint and a neatly made bed. A reminder that some stains on a property's history cannot ever be truly washed away. Number 15 takes us to the heart of a bustling Chicago neighborhood where a young professional named Sarah booked a stylish loft apartment for a business trip. The building was a converted early 20th century factory, all exposed brick and massive steel beam windows, offering a perfect blend of historic charm and urban convenience. Her unit was on the 3rd floor, and after a long day of meetings, she was looking forward to a quiet evening to herself. That quiet, however, was shattered the moment she tried to fall asleep. It began around 11 p.m., with the unmistakable thump of a bass line, faint at first, then growing steadily in volume until she could feel the vibration through her floor. This was quickly joined by the murmur of dozens of overlapping conversations, the sharp, percussive clink of glassware, and the occasional burst of uproarious laughter. It was the full, immersive soundscape of a raucous party happening directly above her in the vacant 4th-floor apartment. Annoyed but not yet alarmed, Sarah assumed a last-minute event was underway and tried to wait it out with a pillow over her head. The party didn't wind down, it only seemed to gain energy, the sounds of a swing band suddenly cutting through the noise with the clear, brassy notes of a trumpet and the rhythmic swish of a snare drum. By 2 a.m., her patience had evaporated. She marched upstairs, fully prepared to politely ask her neighbors to keep it down, only to find the 4th-floor hallway silent and dark. The heavy industrial door to the loft was sealed with a thick padlock and multiple bolts, a layer of dust coating the handle. Peering through the small, grimy window in the door, she saw a vast, empty space. There was no furniture, no party decorations, no discarded cups, just an expansive floor covered in a uniform layer of dust and forgotten construction materials stacked in a corner. The music and laughter continued unabated, seeming to emanate from the very walls around her, yet the source was utterly invisible. The next morning, exhausted and bewildered, she approached the building's superintendent in the lobby. Before she could even finish her complaint about the noisy neighbors, he held up a hand with a weary, knowing sigh. "Let me guess," he said, "the 4th-floor party. The one with the old-timey music." He explained that the loft had been completely vacant for nearly a decade, ever since a fire had destroyed the interior and a protracted legal battle had left the ownership in limbo. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part, he said, was that new tenants in her unit reported the exact same experience about once or twice a year. The sounds were always the same, a large, joyful gathering that would start late and go until the early hours, featuring music that sounded decades out of date. A long-time resident sipping coffee in the lobby overheard the conversation and nodded in agreement. He filled in the rest of the story. The building hadn't always been lofts. Back in the 1940s and 50s, it was a manufacturing plant for a now-defunct clothing company. The vast, open 4th floor had been the factory's main hall, and the owners were famous for throwing enormous, lavish holiday parties for their hundreds of employees right there on the production floor. There was a legendary New Year's Eve party in 1948 that had gone until sunrise, a massive event with a live swing band, flowing champagne, and the entire workforce celebrating together. The theory among the old-timers in the building was that on certain nights, when the conditions were just right, the building doesn't remember its present, it remembers its past. The laughter Sarah heard wasn't an intrusion from a current tenant. It was an echo, a residual recording of pure joy from 75 years ago, forever trapped in the brick and mortar and occasionally played back for a baffled audience of one. For Sarah, the terror of the unknown was replaced by a profound and eerie sense of melancholy, a feeling of being a temporary witness to a moment of collective happiness that was forever just out of reach. Number 16 on our list unfolds in the sun-scorched suburbs of Tucson, Arizona, where a young man named Leo had booked a casita behind a main house for a week-long visit with friends. The host, an older woman named Brenda, was warm and effusive during check-in, perhaps a little too familiar, immediately remarking on how much Leo reminded her of her late brother. He brushed it off as a common pleasantry, a harmless comment from a friendly retiree, and thought nothing more of it as he settled into the comfortable Southwestern-style guest house. The unease began the next morning. Leo was rummaging through a kitchen drawer for a pen when his hand brushed against a small, leather-bound photo album tucked behind the instruction manuals for the appliances. Curious, he flipped it open, expecting to find vintage family vacation shots or pictures of the property. The first few pages were just that, smiling, unfamiliar people from the 70s and 80s posing in front of sedans and birthday cakes. But as he turned to the middle of the album, his own breath caught in his throat. There he was, in a series of professionally printed photographs. His face was seamlessly photoshopped onto the bodies of other people. In one, he was standing arm in arm with a younger version of Brenda in front of a Christmas tree. In another, he was depicted as a teenager, his features awkwardly grafted onto a boy in a Little League uniform with the caption, "Jason's first home run," handwritten beneath it. A cold dread washed over him. This wasn't a random prank or a case of mistaken identity. The images were meticulously crafted, the lighting and shadows carefully matched to make the digital forgery as convincing as possible. His own social media profile pictures had been harvested and expertly altered to insert him into decades of this family's history. Just then, a soft knock came at the door. It was Brenda holding a plate of freshly baked cookies. "I thought you might like a snack, Jason," she said with a gentle smile. The use of the wrong name, uttered with such maternal certainty, sent a jolt of pure fear through him. He held up the album, his hand trembling slightly, and asked her what this was. Her reaction was not one of embarrassment or panic, but of serene confusion. "It's our family album, sweetheart," she said, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. She then proceeded to walk him through the photos, telling detailed, heartfelt stories about Jason's childhood, his graduation, his achievements, all woven from a tapestry of delusion so complete and internally consistent that it was utterly terrifying. She genuinely believed he was her nephew, a young man who had, in reality, tragically passed away in a car accident over 15 years earlier. In a grief-stricken mind, she had been waiting for him to come home, and Leo's booking, with his passing resemblance to her late brother, had provided the catalyst for a full break from reality. Leo managed to extricate himself from the conversation, his mind reeling. Back inside the casita with the door locked, he immediately called Airbnb's safety line. The representative, hearing the sheer terror and bizarre nature of his story, stayed on the line with him while simultaneously patching in a local crisis response team. This wasn't a standard host-guest dispute. This was a clear mental health emergency. Within the hour, a pair of sympathetic crisis counselors and a police officer arrived. Leo watched from the window as they spoke with Brenda on her front porch. He saw the moment her fragile fantasy shattered, the confusion, and then the overwhelming wave of anguish that crumpled her face as she was gently confronted with the truth. She wasn't arrested. She was calmly, compassionately escorted to a waiting car to be taken to a facility for evaluation and care. For Leo, the resolution was bittersweet. The immediate threat was gone, but the experience left him with a profound and unsettling sorrow. He hadn't been targeted by a malicious stalker, but had instead become an unwilling actor in someone else's profound tragedy. His vacation rental had been more than a building. It was the stage for a heartbreaking performance of grief, where the lines between past and present, reality and delusion, had been completely erased. This story serves as a haunting reminder that the most complex and frightening discoveries aren't always about what's hidden in the walls, but what's hidden in the mind of the person who holds the key. Journeying now to the hauntingly beautiful lowcountry of South Carolina, Story 17 immerses us in the deep, unresolved pain of American history. A couple had booked a long weekend at a magnificent antebellum mansion turned bed and breakfast in the heart of Charleston's historic district. The property was the epitome of southern grandeur, with towering white columns, sweeping verandas, and sprawling oak trees dripping with silvery Spanish moss. The hostess, a woman whose family had owned the home for generations, welcomed them with a polished, rehearsed tour, speaking with pride about the architecture, the original crystal chandeliers, and the home's status as a cherished historic landmark. The darker chapters of its past were neatly glossed over, mentioned only in passing as a footnote to its beauty. The first chill came not from the air conditioning, but from the atmosphere itself. As they were shown to their room on the second floor, a palpable heaviness seemed to press down on them, a silent, watchful energy that felt entirely separate from the hostess's cheerful commentary. That night, as they tried to sleep in the lavish four-poster bed, the house began to speak. The first sound was a soft, metallic scraping, like something heavy and iron being slowly dragged across the heart pine floorboards downstairs. It was followed by a deep, guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the very walls, a sound of pure exhaustion and anguish that had no human source yet felt utterly sentient. The wife, woken by the noise, also became aware of a drastic temperature drop. While the rest of the room was comfortably warm, an invisible sphere of cold air enveloped her side of the bed, so frigid she could see her own breath forming faint plumes in the moonlight. The feeling within this cold spot was not just one of low temperature, but of profound despair, a sadness so heavy it brought involuntary tears to her eyes. Her husband, initially skeptical, reached over and immediately pulled his hand back. The air above her was like ice, a defined pocket of winter in the otherwise humid southern night. The following day, deeply unsettled, they decided to visit the local historical society, hoping for some context that might explain their experience. The archivist they spoke to, an older man with a kind but solemn demeanor, listened to their story about the cold spots and the sound of chains. When they mentioned the name of the property, his expression shifted to one of grim recognition. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound ledger from a shelf and opened it to a page containing old property records and slave manifests. The beautiful bed and breakfast, he explained, had been one of the largest rice plantations in the region, its wealth and grandeur built entirely on the backs of hundreds of enslaved people. The archivist revealed that the property was infamous among local historians and paranormal researchers. Numerous guests over the years had reported identical experiences: the feeling of sudden, isolated cold, the overwhelming emotion of sorrow, and the unmistakable, haunting sound of chains dragging across the floor, most often heard from the basement and the back staircase, the routes the enslaved would have been forced to use. These weren't random, playful ghosts. These were residual echoes of unimaginable suffering, a spiritual energy so potent it had permanently stained the very atmosphere of the home. The sounds and the cold were not a threat, but a testament, a relentless memorial to the lives that were spent and lost within those walls. The couple returned to the property that evening with a completely changed perspective. The grandeur now felt like a facade, the opulent decor a stark contrast to the pain soaked into the foundations. They didn't hear the chains again, but they felt the presence all around them, a silent, dignified, and grieving energy that refused to be erased by time, paint, or polite conversation. Their weekend getaway had become a sobering history lesson, a direct and chilling connection to a past that the beautiful house itself could not forget. Number 18 buzzes us into the arid, high desert landscape of southern Utah, where a family from Denver booked a rustic adobe-style home for a spring break hiking trip. The property was marketed as an eco-friendly desert retreat, boasting natural building materials and passive solar design. From the outside, it was charming and unique, with thick, rounded walls and a vibrant wildflower garden that seemed to hum with life. The first hint of the home's truly unique feature came the moment they stepped inside. A low, pervasive, vibrational hum was audible the second the heavy wooden door closed behind them, a steady droning that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. At first, they assumed it was a quirk of the desert climate, perhaps a powerful whole-house fan or an industrial-grade water pump. But as they settled in, the sound became impossible to ignore. It was a living buzz, a collective thrum that would occasionally pulse and intensify for no discernible reason. The second clue presented itself on the first warm afternoon. A sweet, cloying smell began to permeate the air, reminiscent of overripe fruit and flowers. Then they noticed the stains along the seams where the walls met the ceiling in the living room. Thick, amber-colored liquid was slowly, inexorably seeping through the plaster, leaving sticky, crystallized trails down the painted surface. The father, curious and slightly concerned, gently pressed his ear to the warm wall. The hum wasn't just audible, he could feel it vibrating through the plaster and into his skull. It was the unmistakable sound of a colossal, active beehive. A frantic investigation of the exterior of the house revealed the truth. Dozens of bees were casually flying in and out of a small crack near the roofline, their flight path a well-established highway to and from the hidden interior of the wall. The entire south-facing side of the adobe home wasn't just a structure, it was a functioning, multi-layered apiary. They immediately called the host, a man who answered with the laid-back demeanor of someone who had gotten this call before. Instead of expressing alarm or apology, he chuckled. "Oh, you've met the girls," he said brightly. He explained with evident pride that he had intentionally designed the walls to be bee-friendly, citing the declining bee population and his commitment to permaculture principles. He called the buzzing a form of natural white noise, and the honey slowly leaking into the house a free, artisanal air freshener. He encouraged them to embrace the experience, and even provided a cleverly designed, sterile tap on an interior wall they could use to harvest their own honey for toast. For the host, this was a sustainable utopia. For his guests, it was a nightmare of potential liability and constant anxiety. One of the children had a known but mild allergy to bee stings, and the idea of sharing their living space with tens of thousands of stinging insects was utterly terrifying. Every moment was spent in nervous anticipation, fearing a mass disturbance that could send a swarm pouring into the home. They cut their trip short, unable to relax in a house that literally pulsated with life. This story stands as a bizarre conflict between idealism and practicality, where a host's well-intentioned, eco-conscious experiment created an environment that was, for his unwitting guests, less a retreat and more a beautifully constructed, dangerously sweet hive. Our 19th story unfolds in the charming, colonial-era town of Salem, Massachusetts, where a couple had booked a cozy cottage for a weekend of exploring the area's rich history. From the very first interaction, something felt uniquely peculiar about their host. A woman named Eliza, who appeared to be in her late 60s with a distinctive shock of white hair and vibrant green glasses, warmly welcomed them at the door, gave a quick tour, and left them with a key and a cheerful wave. The first oddity arose when the husband went to a small local market later that afternoon. As he was checking out, the cashier, an elderly man, asked where he was staying. Upon hearing the address, the man chuckled and said, "Ah, you've met Elena then, she's a character." Confused, the guest corrected him, stating their host's name was Eliza. The cashier just shook his head with a knowing smile and said, "Must be her sister. The twins are always mixing people up." Back at the cottage, the couple laughed it off, assuming it was a simple case of mistaken identity or a local inside joke. Their amusement faded that evening when there was a sharp knock at the door. Standing on the porch was a woman who was the mirror image of Eliza, same white hair, same green glasses, same height and build. "I'm Elena," she announced sternly, pushing past them into the living room. "I need to check the thermostat. Eliza always sets it far too low and it's terrible for the pipes." She briskly adjusted the temperature, offered a curt nod, and left as suddenly as she had arrived. The couple was left standing in stunned silence. Just a few hours later, as they were preparing for bed, another knock came. This time it was Eliza, beaming with the same warmth from that morning. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said sweetly. "I think my sister may have stopped by." She gets terribly confused since her operation and sometimes believes this is still her home. Please just humor her if she returns. The psychological whiplash of the weekend had officially begun. Over the next 2 days, the twins conducted a masterclass in confusion. One would arrive with a plate of cookies and a reminder that checkout was at 11 a.m. sharp. The other would appear an hour later with a bottle of wine, apologizing for her sister's brusqueness and insisting there was no rush to leave, even offering a late checkout until 2 p.m. Rules about trash disposal, parking, and even which towels to use were constantly contradicted with each visit. The couple found themselves second-guessing every instruction, their relaxing getaway devolving into a bizarre game of mental chess where they never knew which queen was moving the pieces. The bizarre climax came on their final morning. The wife was sipping coffee on the back patio when Elena approached, not from the driveway but from the side gate of the property. Seeing the guest, she let out a loud, genuine laugh that carried none of her previous sternness. "Oh, you're still here," she exclaimed, her entire demeanor shifting from severe to mischievously gleeful. "I bet she's got you all turned around, doesn't she?" It was then that she revealed the truth. There was no dementia, no confusion. This was an elaborate, long-running game the sisters had played for years on their unsuspecting guests. They would take turns playing the kind and strict twin, weaving contradictory stories and switching places at random intervals just to see how their renters would react. They kept a private journal detailing the reactions, rating guests on their level of confusion and politeness under pressure. For them, it was the ultimate source of entertainment, a way to inject drama and laughter into their retired lives. The couple left Massachusetts not with a sense of historical wonder, but with a dizzying story about two sisters who turned their rental property into a live-action psychological experiment, proving that the most unsettling strangeness doesn't always come from a place of malice, but sometimes from a deeply peculiar sense of fun. Number 20 brings us to the wide open spaces of rural Montana, where a group of friends had booked a sprawling ranch property for a hunting trip. The main house was a classic, no-frills log cabin, exactly what they were looking for: spacious, rugged, and surrounded by breathtaking mountain views. During the initial tour, their host, a burly, quiet man named Dale, was thorough but pointedly brief when they passed a heavy, steel-reinforced door in the hallway. "Basement's off limits, storage not part of the rental," he stated flatly, his tone leaving no room for questions. He handed them the keys and left without another word. For the first 2 days, they respected the rule, but curiosity is a powerful force, especially when combined with the boredom that can set in after nightfall in the middle of nowhere. The door itself was a fortress compared to the rest of the rustic cabin, secured by a substantial padlock. One of the men, an engineer by trade, noticed that the door's frame, while heavy, was set into the original old logs of the home. With a few cleverly applied tools from their truck and a significant amount of leveraged force, they managed to pop the entire locking mechanism loose from the aged wood, reasoning they could easily fix it before they left. What they discovered on the other side defied all their expectations. This was no dusty root cellar. A set of poured concrete stairs led down into a cold, humming, clinically clean underground facility. Motion sensor lights flickered on to illuminate a space the size of a large apartment. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and dried goods. Rows of industrial metal shelves were packed to capacity with canned food, giant bags of rice and beans, medical supplies, and water purification systems. One entire wall was dedicated to power generation, featuring a massive diesel generator and a complex bank of batteries. But the sight that truly stole the breath from their lungs was the armory. A custom-made glass front cabinet, securely locked but completely visible, displayed an arsenal that would outfit a small militia: multiple semi-automatic rifles, handguns, and enough ammunition to last through a decade of firefights. They were still standing there, mouths agape in the sterile fluorescent light, when a voice roared from the top of the stairs. "What in the hell do you think you're doing?" Dale stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He stormed down the steps, not with the panic of a man caught in a lie, but with the righteous indignation of a king defending his castle. He didn't ask them to leave. He began a loud, passionate lecture on the fragility of modern society, the inevitable collapse of the grid, and the moral imperative of being prepared to protect one's family. He called them sheep for trusting the government and fools for their careless intrusion. This wasn't a hidden secret he was ashamed of. It was his life's work, his sanctuary, and they had violated it. The friends backed out slowly, offering frantic apologies, their hearts pounding. They hastily repaired the doorframe as best they could, packed their gear in the middle of the night, and fled the property at dawn. They left a note simply saying, "Family emergency," too terrified of Dale's reaction to tell the truth. The experience was less about the fear of the weapons or the supplies themselves, but the terrifying fervor in their host's eyes. They had stumbled past the boundary of a simple rental agreement and into the deeply fortified psyche of a man who lived every day waiting for the world to end. A man for whom their vacation was a frivolous distraction happening on top of his very serious, very real fortress. It was a chilling reminder that the American landscape is dotted with hidden worlds, and sometimes the door is locked for a reason far more complex and unsettling than mere storage. Number 21 glitters with the faded glamour of old Hollywood, taking us high into the Hollywood Hills to a secluded mid-century modern home where the lines between the silver screen and the afterlife became permanently blurred. A screenwriter seeking inspiration and solitude to work on a new script had booked the property precisely because of its history. The listing openly mentioned it had once been owned by a beloved, Oscar-winning actor from the golden age of cinema, a man known for his charismatic charm and tragic, early death from a heart attack in the master bedroom. For the writer, this wasn't a deterrent, it was the main attraction, a chance to soak up the creative energy of a bygone era. The first night was quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of Los Angeles and the rustle of the canyon winds. But on the second evening, as the writer sat at the vintage desk, the atmosphere in the house shifted palpably. The air grew heavy and still, and the distinct, sweet aroma of pipe tobacco, a scent completely absent before, wafted through the room. The actor had been famously fond of his custom blend pipe. Then, from the hallway, came a sound that made the writer's pen freeze above the paper. It was a rich, melodious baritone voice, clear as day, reciting a line from one of the actor's most iconic films. The phrase was delivered with the same dramatic cadence and emotional weight it held in the original performance, but it echoed as if from a great distance, a haunting broadcast from another time. Heart racing, the writer grabbed his phone, opening a voice memo app just as the voice spoke again. This time a different, more poignant line from a later, dramatic role. He managed to capture the final few words, the audio crisp and undeniable on the recording. This began a nightly ritual. The apparition would make its presence known first with the smell of tobacco, then with the disembodied recitation of famous lines, sometimes playful, sometimes somber, but always perfectly in character. The writer, now more fascinated than frightened, began to actively engage, setting up multiple recording devices and even daring to ask questions into the empty air. On one recording, after he asked what it was like to work with a certain legendary director, there was a pause followed by a warm, familiar chuckle and the words, "A true visionary but a perfectionist who drove us all mad," delivered in that unmistakable voice. Unable to keep this incredible secret, the writer reached out to a team of reputable paranormal investigators he found through a university contact. Skeptical but intrigued by the high-quality audio evidence, they agreed to do a single night's investigation. They arrived with a van full of equipment, EMF readers, infrared cameras, and highly sensitive microphones. For the first few hours, the house was silent. Then, just as the investigators were beginning to pack up, the scent of pipe tobacco filled the master bedroom. All their equipment spiked at once. The EMF readers spiked into the red, the temperature in one corner of the room dropped 20 degrees, and their parabolic microphone captured the same rich baritone, this time reciting a Shakespearean soliloquy the actor had performed on stage early in his career. The lead investigator, a man who had spent decades debunking hauntings, was visibly shaken. He stated on record that in all his years, he had never encountered electronic voice phenomena of such clarity and length, with corresponding environmental data that was, in his words, deeply anomalous. The writer left the hills with a finished script and a collection of audio files that defied easy explanation. This story stands apart from others of its kind because of the quality of the interaction and the verification by trained skeptics. This wasn't a shadowy figure or a malevolent force. It was a personality, a performance that continued long after the final curtain call. It suggests a haunting not of trauma or unrest, but of passion, a spirit so in love with his art, so defined by his craft, that he simply couldn't stop performing, forever rehearsing his greatest hits for an audience of one in the empty theater of his former home. Arriving at number 22, our journey takes a sinister turn from passive observation to active manipulation, landing us in the high desert outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. An artist named Chloe had booked a week-long stay at a sprawling adobe compound, drawn by the listing's promise of a creative retreat with like-minded individuals and daily yoga at sunrise. The host, a disarmingly charismatic man named Gabriel, greeted her with a warm embrace and a glass of herbal tea, immediately making her feel like she was arriving not at a rental but at a homecoming. The other guests she met that first evening were equally warm, though they all shared a similar serene, almost placid demeanor and a tendency to echo Gabriel's philosophical phrases about shedding the old self and embracing the universal flow. The first mandatory event was billed as a simple, welcome circle after dinner. What began as a sharing of travel stories quickly pivoted into a highly personal and emotionally charged session. Gabriel, seated in the center of the group, expertly probed into each guest's insecurities and life dissatisfactions, offering his own brand of wisdom as the only true solution. He spoke of a coming planetary shift that only a prepared, enlightened few would survive, and he positioned himself and his community as the sole guides through this impending chaos. The evening ended with a powerful, orchestrated group hug that left Chloe feeling emotionally drained yet strangely bonded to these strangers. The next morning, the true structure of the retreat revealed itself. A printed itinerary was slipped under her door, outlining a rigorous schedule from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. It included not just yoga, but mandatory awareness seminars, financial clarity workshops, and gratitude-sharing sessions. Attendance was not a request, it was a requirement for continued residence on the property. The seminars were masterclasses in psychological pressure, employing classic cult tactics of love bombing, showering her with affection and validation followed by isolationist rhetoric, convincing attendees that their friends and family on the outside would never understand their new enlightened path. The financial workshop was the breaking point. Seated one-on-one with a senior member of the group, Chloe was presented with a detailed chart explaining the energy exchange necessary for her continued spiritual growth. It started with a suggested donation of $5,000 to support the community's vital work, but the presenter quickly pivoted to discussing the transfer of all her assets, including her retirement account and even the equity in her home, to the group's holding company for safekeeping and purification before the coming societal collapse. When she hesitantly declined, citing the need to think it over, the room's energy shifted instantly. The warm, smiling facilitator's face went cold. Gabriel was summoned, and he spent the next hour subjecting her to an intense, private lecture about her attachment to ego and resistance to her own freedom. framing her financial prudence as a spiritual failing. Terrified but thinking clearly, Chloe feigned illness and retreated to her casita. She immediately began secretly recording audio on her phone of the interactions that followed, as various members took turns coming to her door to check on her while subtly reiterating the pressure to contribute. She managed to send a coded text for help to a friend back home, who immediately contacted the local sheriff's office. The police, upon arrival, were initially met with Gabrielle's practiced charm, but their questions grew more pointed as Chloe played her recordings. The situation was far bigger than a pushy host. It was a well-organized recruitment funnel. A subsequent investigation, joined by the FBI, uncovered that the retreat was the primary intake center for a sophisticated, multi-million-dollar cult that had been targeting vulnerable travelers for years, siphoning their life savings and cutting them off from their families under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. What had been advertised as a peaceful creative getaway was, in reality, a gilded trap, a carefully staged production designed to identify and exploit individuals at a crossroads in their lives, using the trusted platform of a vacation rental to lure in its unsuspecting prey. Our 23rd tale brings us to a stately, if slightly frayed, Victorian mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, a city known for its Gilded Age opulence. A young couple had booked the Sea Captain's Quarters, a self-contained apartment on the second floor of one of these grand old homes, now divided into several rental units. The listing made a charming feature of the home's history and quirks, mentioning that the walls were thin and that past guests had enjoyed feeling a connection to the home's storied past. They arrived to find the space beautifully decorated with nautical antiques and period-appropriate furniture, and they settled in, charmed by the creaking floorboards and the smell of old wood. The first communication arrived on their first morning. A small, folded piece of yellowed parchment paper had been slipped under their door. In an elegant, spidery cursive script it read, "Pray, cease thy infernal racket post haste." "The hour is late for decent folk." They laughed, assuming it was a bit of playful theater staged by the host to enhance the historic atmosphere. The husband, playing along, found a fountain pen in a desk drawer and wrote a reply on the back, "Our deepest apologies, good spirit. The wireless music box shall be silenced. We are but humble travelers from the future." He slipped the note under the door to the adjacent unit, from which they had heard faint sounds of movement the night before. The spirit wrote back almost immediately, "Future, you say, your garments are most peculiar. Explain thyself." This began a bizarre and increasingly entertaining correspondence that spanned their entire weekend. They would leave questions about life in the 19th century, and the ghost would respond with elaborate, beautifully written descriptions of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps, complaining about the ghastly metal beasts now clogging the streets below. They, in turn, would describe the wonders of airplanes and the internet, which the spirit declared to be fanciful lies and sorcery. It was the highlight of their trip, a wonderfully immersive game that made them feel like they had stepped into a living novel. The enchanting illusion was shattered on their final evening. They had just received a particularly poignant note from their Victorian pen pal, lamenting the loneliness of eternity, when they heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock of the adjacent apartment. Peeking through their own keyhole, they didn't see a spectral figure fading into the ether. They saw a couple about their own age, dragging modern roller suitcases and complaining loudly about their flight being delayed. Seized by a sudden, hilarious realization, the husband whipped open his door just as the new neighbors were entering theirs. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the stack of parchment notes. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about these, would you?" The new guests looked confused for a moment, then the woman's face broke into a wide grin. "Oh my God," she laughed. "You're the time travelers. We thought you were the hosts. We got here last night and found your first note and just assumed it was part of the themed experience." It turned out the previous renters next door had left a day early, and this new couple had arrived, found the ongoing correspondence, and decided to continue the role play without missing a beat. The two couples ended up sharing a bottle of wine, howling with laughter as they pieced together the misunderstanding. They had not been communicating with a lonely ghost from the 1890s, but with two confused accountants from New Jersey who were just very, very good at improv. The story stands as a heartwarming and hilarious reminder that the magic of a place often isn't in its actual history, but in the wonderful, collaborative stories we choose to create together. Leaving behind the surreal misunderstandings of the Rhode Island time travelers, our 24th story descends into a realm of profound, gut-wrenching social discomfort. A family from the Midwest, consisting of two parents and their teenage son, had booked a spacious craftsman-style home outside of Nashville for a week of exploring the city's legendary music scene. As they pulled into the driveway of the quiet, tree-lined property, their first observation was the number of cars already parked along the street. They assumed it was just a busy day for the neighbors and thought nothing more of it as they unloaded their luggage and approached the front door. Their host, an elderly woman named Agnes with puffy, red-rimmed eyes, answered their knock. Her voice was thick with emotion as she welcomed them inside, clutching a damp tissue in her trembling hand. The moment they crossed the threshold, the reason for the gathered cars became horrifyingly clear. The large living room to their left had been entirely transformed. All the normal furniture had been pushed against the walls. In the center of the room, surrounded by a sea of floral arrangements, was an open casket. A steady stream of somber, black-clad mourners filed past it, some dabbing their eyes, others speaking in hushed, reverent tones. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of lilies and the palpable weight of grief. They had not arrived at a vacation rental. They had walked directly into a wake. Stunned into silence, the family stood frozen in the foyer as Agnes, seemingly oblivious to their shock, began explaining the situation. "This is for my dearest friend, Elena," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She left us 2 days ago. The viewing was supposed to be at the funeral home, but they had a scheduling conflict. We had to move it here at the last moment. I do hope you understand." Before they could formulate a response, she then delivered the line that would define their nightmare. "But please, don't feel you need to hide away. You are our guests. You must stay and pay your respects." Elena would have wanted her home filled with love. What followed was an hour of pure, unadulterated social agony. They were ushered into the living room by their grieving host and introduced to the deceased woman's bewildered family members as the lovely folks renting the upstairs. Forced into a receiving line, they shook hands with a dozen strangers who looked at them with a mixture of confusion and pity, muttering empty condolences for a loss they didn't share for a person they had never met. They stood awkwardly in a corner, trying to make themselves as small as possible while mourners shared heartfelt eulogies about a woman's lifelong kindness and passion for gardening, an intimate memorial they were crashing solely because they had paid for the privilege. The teenage son, utterly mortified, spent the entire time staring at his shoes, while the parents exchanged frantic, wide-eyed looks of "what do we do?" Every instinct screamed to grab their bags and run, but the social pressure, the sheer weight of the room's sorrow, held them prisoner. Leaving felt like the ultimate act of disrespect, a cruel abandonment of a host who was clearly in the depths of a genuine emotional crisis. They were trapped in a vortex of morbid politeness, their vacation plans completely derailed by a profound and unexpected collision with a stranger's raw grief. It was only after the final mourner had left and the funeral home staff arrived to remove the casket that they were able to retreat to their upstairs rooms, the cheerful energy of their holiday spirit completely extinguished, replaced by the haunting, funereal silence of a house in mourning. Most vacation rentals aim for charm or comfort, but our 25th story takes us to a rental in the misty forests of Oregon that was designed for something else entirely: manufactured terror. A group of friends, all self-proclaimed horror movie buffs, booked a weekend at a cabin specifically advertised as the haunted experience. The listing was filled with spooky, atmospheric photos and promised interactive encounters with the unknown, which they enthusiastically interpreted as seances, maybe some creepy sound effects, or perhaps a host in a costume telling ghost stories by the fire. It sounded like the ultimate Halloween in July. The first clue that this experience was more intense than they'd imagined came the moment they opened the creaky front door. A motion sensor triggered a deafening, recorded shriek that echoed through the empty living room, followed by the sudden, violent slamming of an interior door down the hall. They jumped, then laughed it off, high-fiving each other and praising the host's commitment to the theme. The laughter became more nervous as they ventured further inside. Pressure plates on the floor made ghostly moans emanate from hidden speakers. A tripwire in the hallway sent a swarm of rubber bats swooping down from the ceiling on nearly invisible strings. It was like walking through a high-end haunted house attraction, and they were the only players. The true horror of the situation, however, didn't reveal itself until they tried to go to bed. One of the friends, a man in his late 50s named Frank, had a known but well-managed heart condition. He'd been a good sport all evening, jumping with everyone else at the various surprises, but he was growing visibly tired and stressed, the constant adrenaline spikes taking a toll. As he went to use the master bathroom before turning in, he pushed the door open and took 2 steps inside. The room was pitch black, but as his foot landed on a specific tile, a brilliant strobe light fired directly into his eyes. At the exact same moment, a full-size, articulated plastic skeleton shot down from the ceiling on a loud, rattling track, stopping inches from his face while a blood-curdling scream blasted from a speaker behind the mirror. The effect was immediate and devastating. Frank stumbled backward out of the bathroom, clutching his chest, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was gasping for air, his heart hammering in a painful, irregular rhythm that he knew was not just a simple fright. This was a full-blown cardiac episode, triggered by a shock so severe and unexpected it bypassed any sense of fun and went straight to primal terror. His friends rushed to his aid, frantically helping him find his medication and calling 911. An ambulance arrived 20 minutes later to take him to the nearest hospital, where he was monitored overnight for what doctors confirmed was a severe stress-induced arrhythmia. When the group finally contacted the host to explain the medical emergency his attraction had caused, the response was not an apology but a defensive justification. The host, a special effects technician, argued that the listing was clearly labeled an experience and that the onus was on the guests to understand what that entailed. He pointed to the dense, fine print disclaimer buried at the bottom of the property description that mentioned startling effects and interactive spooky elements, claiming it was sufficient warning. He seemed genuinely baffled that anyone would have a medical reaction to what he considered good, clean fun. The fallout was severe. Frank and his family pursued and won a significant civil lawsuit against the host for gross negligence and failure to adequately warn of known dangers, a case that hinged on the argument that a private home rigged with pneumatic props and intense sensory effects is a fundamentally different environment than a public attraction with clear safety protocols and medical staff on standby. The rental platform permanently banned the host and scrubbed the listing, issuing new guidelines that required any property using such effects to provide explicit upfront warnings and to secure a liability waiver from all guests before confirmation. This story serves as a darkly ironic cautionary tale about the very real physical danger that can lurk behind a facade of fake scares, where a host's passion for theatricality completely overrode the basic responsibility of ensuring his guests' safety. The suburban streets of Oak Park, Illinois, were the picture of placid normality when a family arrived for their week-long stay, the towering old trees and meticulously manicured lawns projecting an aura of Midwestern tranquility. Their rental, a classic 2-story brick home, seemed perfect, The first evening was peaceful, filled with the familiar sounds of unpacking and settling in. The only oddity was a lingering, hostile glare from an elderly man watering his immaculate rose bushes next door, a look so intense the father made a mental note to ensure his children didn't accidentally send a soccer ball into that yard. They dismissed it as typical city-to-suburb culture shock and went to bed. The war began on the second night, just after 9 p.m. As the family was watching a movie, every light, screen, and appliance in the house went dead. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the hum of neighboring homes that were still brightly lit. Assuming a simple breaker had tripped, the father fetched his phone for a flashlight and headed to the basement. The electrical panel told a different story. The main breaker wasn't just switched off. The entire heavy-duty switch had been physically pried open, and the mechanism inside smashed beyond repair with what looked like a hammer. This was no accident. It was a deliberate, violent act of sabotage. Fumbling in the dark, they called the host, a woman named Sarah who lived an hour away. Her reaction was a weary, frustrated sigh. "It's him again, my neighbor, Mr. Gable. I am so sorry. I'll have an emergency electrician there first thing in the morning." She explained this wasn't the first time. For months, Mr. Gable had been waging a one-man war against her rental property, furious that strangers were constantly moving in and out of what he called his neighborhood. He had started with angry letters to the Homeowners Association, escalated to filing frivolous complaints with the city about parking and noise, and had now moved on to outright property destruction. The family, shivering in the dark, were merely collateral damage in a bitter, ongoing feud. The electrician arrived at dawn and made temporary repairs, but the real message came later that afternoon. While the family was out at a museum trying to salvage their day, Mr. Gable made his next move. They returned to find the pristine white siding of the rental home marred by enormous, dripping red spray paint letters. "Strangers not welcome" was scrawled across the front, and on the garage door a more direct threat: "Leave or else." The children were terrified and the parents were furious. They called the police and a livid Sarah simultaneously. The confrontation that unfolded on the neatly trimmed lawn was a spectacle of suburban hostility. Mr. Gable, confronted by police, didn't deny a thing. He stood proudly by his roses and launched into a tirade about the sanctity of community, the degradation of his neighborhood by transient renters, and the host's greed in turning a family home into a motel. Sarah, who had raced to the property, fired back, her voice shaking with anger, explaining that she was a single mother relying on the rental income to keep the home her own family had lived in for generations. The police were stuck mediating a deeply personal conflict with no easy resolution. They took a report for criminal damage to property but could only issue a warning to Mr. Gable. For the family, the vacation was ruined. They spent their final nights there, jumping at every sound, peering out the windows at the darkened house next door, feeling like prisoners in a property they had paid to enjoy. They cut their trip short, fleeing the oppressive atmosphere of resentment. This story exposes a very modern tension rippling through communities nationwide. It's no longer just about ghosts or bad hosts. It's about the silent, seething anger of those living next door, a rage against the changing landscape of travel that can turn a quiet street into a battlefield where guests are the unintended casualties. Number 27 takes the concept of a bad booking and transforms it into a surreal suburban nightmare, one that unfolds not in a remote forest or a creaky old mansion, but in the heart of a meticulously planned California subdivision. A young couple, new parents traveling with their infant, had booked a modern townhouse in a sprawling development outside of San Diego for a visit with relatives. They arrived long after dark, exhausted from a day of travel and a fussy baby, the kind of deep fatigue that turns a simple task like finding a house key into a monumental challenge. Their GPS had guided them to the general area, but the final turn onto their designated street, Cielo Vista Lane, revealed a scene of dizzying uniformity. Under the orange glow of the streetlights, every single house was an exact replica of its neighbor. Same taupe stucco, same black shutters, same perfectly manicured boxwood shrubs lining identical stone walkways. It was a maze of domestic duplication. The house number they were looking for was 134. They slowly cruised past 118, 122, 126, each one a carbon copy. They finally spotted 134 and pulled into the short driveway, relief washing over them. The keypad for the lockbox was right where the host said it would be, mounted discreetly beside the pristine front door. The father punched in the 4-digit code, heard the satisfying clunk of the mechanism releasing, and retrieved the key. He slid it into the deadbolt. It turned with a smooth, effortless click. They were in. They pushed the door open, grateful to finally be at their destination, and carried their sleeping baby and their luggage into the dark, quiet home. The first sign that something was amiss was the smell. Instead of the neutral, clean scent they expected from the listing photos, the air was rich with the aroma of garlic, onions, and simmering tomatoes, as if someone had just finished cooking a large Italian dinner. Before they could process this, a door down the hallway swung open, flooding the space with light and revealing a man in his bathrobe, holding a toothbrush and staring at them with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. A woman's voice called from another room, "Honey, who is it?" In that horrifying, heart-stopping instant, they realized their catastrophic mistake. The key had worked perfectly, but they were in the wrong house. They were standing in the living room of 136 Cielo Vista Lane, not 134. In their exhausted state, they had transposed the numbers and walked into a stranger's home. The ensuing moments were a blur of panicked apologies, the startled homeowner's initial fear quickly turning to bewildered anger as he demanded to know how they had gotten inside. They fumbled for their phone, showing him the booking confirmation, pointing frantically at the address, explaining about the identical lockboxes. As they backed out of the door, profusely apologizing, they saw the correct house, their actual rental directly next door. Its lockbox was in the exact same spot. Its front door was the exact same model. The key the host had given them for 134 had, astoundingly, also unlocked the front door of 136. Their ordeal, however, was far from over. The rightful homeowner, now rightfully paranoid that a master key was circulating through the neighborhood, didn't just let it go. He immediately activated the local neighborhood watch group's phone tree. Within minutes, the quiet street was lit up by porch lights flipping on and the distant wail of police sirens growing closer. The couple, now safely inside the correct rental, were met at the door not by a welcoming host, but by two very serious police officers responding to a reported home invasion. It took 20 minutes of showing booking confirmations, text messages with the host, and the officers themselves testing the key, which did, in fact, open both front doors to sort out the unbelievable truth. The fallout revealed a shocking level of developer negligence. An investigation prompted by the police report discovered that the entire tract of homes had been built using a shockingly limited number of lock and key combinations. Dozens of houses shared the same core lock mechanism, a cost-cutting measure that had turned the entire neighborhood into a giant set of interchangeable parts. The couple's vacation became consumed with meetings with the host, the property management company, and the HOA, all of whom were scrambling to contain the liability nightmare. Their story is a uniquely modern terror, one where the horror isn't found in the abnormal, but in the extreme, soul-crushing sameness of suburban planning, where a simple mistake under the glow of a streetlight can turn you from a weary traveler into an accidental intruder, your peaceful getaway shattered by the chilling realization that your key doesn't just open one door, it opens many. Driving into the nation's capital, a group of history students had booked a classic brownstone in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Washington, D.C. envisioning a week of museum hopping and monument tours. The host's description mentioned the home was a true piece of Cold War history, which they assumed was just a reference to its 1960s architecture. The reality was waiting for them in the basement. After dropping their bags, their curiosity led them down the creaking wooden stairs to a cluttered, low-ceilinged space filled with old luggage and holiday decorations. It was there, behind a large, freestanding metal shelving unit, that they found it, a massive, circular, submarine-style door, painted a dull yellow and set directly into the concrete foundation. With considerable effort, they managed to roll the heavy door open on its rusting hinges, the sound a deafening groan that echoed up the staircase. The air that rushed out was cold, stale, and carried the unmistakable scent of dust, old paper, and the faint, metallic tang of fear. A single pull chain hung just inside. A tug sent a bare bulb flickering to life, illuminating a perfectly preserved time capsule from the brink of annihilation. The shelter was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with reinforced concrete walls and a low ceiling that felt immediately oppressive. Metal shelves lined two walls, stacked with the decaying relics of a planned survival that never came to pass. There were large, dented cans of government-issued crackers and powdered milk, their labels faded and peeling. Dozens of plastic jugs of water had turned a sickly shade of green, their contents now a sloshing bacterial culture. A first aid kit lay open, its bandages brittle, its antiseptic long since evaporated. The most chilling finds, however, were the documents. Tucked into a clear plastic sleeve nailed to the wall was a detailed civil defense manual titled "Family Fallout Shelter: Your Key to Survival." Its pages filled with cheerful, cartoonish illustrations of a smiling family calmly waiting out a nuclear attack. Another pamphlet, in stark, serious text, provided chillingly precise instructions on how to decontaminate oneself after exposure to radioactive fallout. For the students, these weren't just historical artifacts. They were a direct line to the palpable, everyday terror of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a visceral connection to a generation that went to sleep each night wondering if the morning would bring a flash of light and the end of everything. Their intellectual fascination curdled into genuine panic later that evening when a sudden, violent summer thunderstorm descended on the city. The power in the house flickered and died, plunging them into darkness just as a tremendous clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the brownstone. In the pitch black, the only sound was the frantic drumming of rain and hail on the streets above, a noise that, to their adrenaline-fueled imaginations, sounded eerily similar to the radioactive fallout the manual had described. One of them, gripped by a sudden, claustrophobic dread of being trapped underground, made a frantic dash for the basement stairs, only to trip in the darkness and slam the heavy shelter door shut with a resonating, final-sounding clang. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. They were now sealed in a concrete tomb, the storm completely muffled, the only sound the ragged, hyperventilating breaths of four people realizing the air was already growing thin. The single light bulb had gone out with the power, leaving them in a blackness so complete it felt solid. The cheerful, cartoon-filled survival manual now seemed like a sick joke. The rusting cans of food were no longer quaint relics but symbols of a doomed, desperate hope. The psychological weight of the shelter's original purpose crashed down on them. This was not a museum exhibit, it was a box built for waiting to die. They fumbled for their phones, but of course there was no signal 3 feet underground in a reinforced concrete bunker. For 20 terrifying minutes, they pushed and shoved against the immensely heavy door in the utter darkness, their panic feeding on itself, until finally, with a collective heave, they managed to roll it open just enough to squeeze out, stumbling back up into the stormy night air with a newfound, horrifying appreciation for the deep, lingering anxiety that still echoes in the foundations. Very city where World War III was once planned. Sun-drenched Florida is the setting for our 29th story, a tale that swaps out supernatural scares for a deeply unsettling kind of psychological whiplash, where the very idea of a trustworthy host was completely demolished. A family had booked a beautiful, modern condo in a high-rise building overlooking the Gulf of Mexico, and their initial check-in with the owner, a friendly and impeccably dressed man named Charles, was seamless. He gave them a thorough tour, showed them how to work the complex entertainment system, and even recommended his favorite local seafood restaurant, leaving them with a warm handshake and a promise to be available if they needed anything. The first 24 hours were paradise, exactly the relaxing beach getaway they had envisioned. The trouble began on the second afternoon with a sharp, impatient knock at the door. Standing on the other side was a man who was the mirror image of Charles, same haircut, same build, even wearing a similar polo shirt, but his demeanor was completely different. This man's posture was rigid, his expression one of severe annoyance. "I need to conduct the quarterly pest inspection," he announced brusquely, not waiting for an invitation before stepping inside. The family, utterly confused, stammered that they just checked in and that Charles hadn't mentioned anything. The man stopped dead in his tracks and turned to face them, his eyes narrowing. "Charles, who is Charles? I'm Robert, the owner of this unit. I have no idea who you're talking about." A cold dread settled over the family. Robert then began a methodical, intrusive walkthrough of the condo, opening closets and cabinets, all while muttering about unauthorized rentals and breach of contract. He pointed to a small scratch on the hardwood floor they'd never noticed and accused them of causing it. He then issued a new, contradictory set of rules. The balcony was now off-limits, the air conditioner was not to be set below 78 degrees, and they were to use only specific, harsh cleaning products he named under the sink. He left as abruptly as he arrived, leaving the family in a state of shocked paralysis, their vacation vibe completely shattered. An hour later, their phones buzzed. It was a text from the original Charles. "Hey folks, just checking in. Hope you're enjoying the sunset from the balcony. It's the best view. Everything okay?" They frantically called him, relaying the bizarre encounter with his aggressive double. Charles laughed, a warm, easy sound that should have been reassuring. "Oh, you met my brother, Robert. I'm so sorry. He's always been a little jealous of this place. Just ignore him completely. He has no authority here. The balcony is all yours, and please crank that see." He apologized profusely and promised to handle it. For the next 3 days, the family was trapped in a maddening loop of conflicting realities. Robert would show up unannounced, his knocks sharp and angry, to inspect for alleged violations of his arbitrary rules. Charles would then call or text with effusive apologies and reassurances, effectively canceling out everything his brother had said. They never saw both men together. It was always one or the other, each one vehemently insisting they were the true owner, and the other was an imposter or an unstable interloper. The family's stress levels skyrocketed. They found themselves jumping at every sound in the hallway, constantly second-guessing which set of instructions to follow. Their relaxing escape transformed into a nerve-wracking test of allegiance. The final straw came when Robert arrived with a printed notice, demanding they vacate the premises immediately due to flagrant violations of the rental agreement, violations that only existed in his own proclamations. As the father was arguing with him, his phone rang. It was Charles. "Is he there right now?" Charles asked, his voice a tense whisper. "Put me on speaker." The father did, and Charles's voice filled the room. "Robert, you need to leave now. This is my home, and these are my guests." Robert's face contorted with rage. "Your home? You lost that right, brother. You know you did." What followed was a blistering 30-second argument broadcast through the phone's speaker, a raw and personal feud about a contested family inheritance and deep-seated resentment that had absolutely nothing to do with the terrified family caught in the middle. They finally understood. They weren't staying in a rental. They were unwilling pawns in a decades-old sibling rivalry, their vacation property the ultimate prize in a battle of identical twins. They packed up and left that same day, the sun-drenched paradise forever ruined not by a ghost or a monster, but by the most terrifying villain of all, dysfunctional family drama. Wisconsin's lush, rolling farm country might seem an unlikely setting for a spectral big top, but for one group of friends who booked a rustic cabin near the small town of Baraboo, their summer getaway became a front-row seat to a show that hadn't played for decades. The property itself was charmingly normal, a simpler frame nestled on the edge of a vast, overgrown field. The listing's description contained only a single offhand line that they'd initially dismissed as quaint local color, quiet area, though some say you can still hear the old carnival on the wind. They assumed it was a metaphor, a folksy way of saying the place had a fun history. They couldn't have been more wrong. The first night was perfectly silent, the only sounds being the chirping of crickets and the distant call of a whippoorwill. It was on the second evening, as dusk bled into a deep, starry night, that the air began to change. It started as the faintest vibration, a low hum that seemed to come up through the ground rather than through the air. Then it coalesced into a distinct, unmistakable sound, the slow, off-key wheeze of a calliope, the classic carnival pipe organ. The music was distant, tinny, and hauntingly melancholic, like a music box left out in the rain. It was accompanied by something even more chilling, the high, clear sound of children's laughter, punctuated by the occasional joyful shriek. Convinced a traveling carnival or a local fair had set up in the field nearby, two of the friends decided to investigate. Grabbing flashlights, they left the cabin and walked toward the source of the sound. The music and laughter grew louder, more immersive, as they pushed through a line of trees at the edge of the property. What they saw in the moonlit field beyond stole the breath from their lungs. The empty field was no longer empty. Flickering like a poorly tuned television channel, a fully formed carnival was in full swing. They could see the silhouettes of a massive Ferris wheel against the night sky, its gondolas swaying gently. They saw the intricate latticework of a carousel, its painted horses frozen in mid-gallop. And they saw the people, dozens of translucent figures in period clothing from the 1920s or 30s, milling about between glowing booths that cast no real light on the ground beneath them. The scene was utterly silent save for the phantom calliope music and laughter that now seemed to be playing inside their own heads. They watched, mesmerized and terrified, as a ghostly father lifted his shimmering daughter onto his shoulders to get a better view of a show they couldn't see. A couple walked past them, arm in arm, their forms briefly solidifying before dissolving into the misty air. The entire spectacle had the quality of a shared lucid dream, vivid and detailed, yet completely detached from reality. After nearly an hour, as abruptly as it began, the music faded, the lights dimmed, and the entire carnival dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the empty, dark field and the overwhelming scent of fresh popcorn and gasoline that hung in the air for a few seconds before vanishing too. Shaken to their core, they visited the local historical society the next morning. The archivist there listened to their story with a knowing, solemn nod. She revealed the tragic truth. From the late 1800s until 1932, a magnificent traveling carnival called Zalman's Marvels had indeed made that very field its permanent summer home. It was a beloved institution, drawing families from all over the state. The tragedy occurred on the final night of the 1932 season. A catastrophic fire, sparked by a faulty generator, had ripped through the packed grounds with horrifying speed. While many escaped, a significant number of patrons and performers, including dozens of children who had been on the rides or trapped in the tent, perished in the blaze. The field was never rebuilt upon. Local legend held that on certain still nights when the veil between worlds was thin, the carnival would return not as a place of horror, but as an echo of its final, joyful moment, an endless encore performance for an audience that never had to go home. The friends had not witnessed a haunting of anger or sorrow, but a memorial of pure, captured joy, a breathtaking and heartbreaking glimpse into the last second of happiness before an unthinkable tragedy forever cemented that place in time. And so we arrive at our final, and perhaps most strangely intimate, story number 31. A tale that asks whether the most powerful force in a haunted location might not be fear, but the deliberate unraveling of love itself. Our destination is a storybook-perfect cabin nestled in the Green Mountains of Vermont, a place that appears on postcards and in dreams, a charming two-room cottage with a stone chimney, surrounded by ancient sugar maples and overlooking a babbling brook. It was marketed as the ultimate romantic retreat, a haven for couples looking to reconnect away from the noise of the modern world. For many who booked it, however, their getaway became the final, agonizing chapter of their relationship. The pattern was subtle at first, noticed only by the host when she began reading through her reviews. One couple would mention a weird tension that settled over them on the first night. Another would write, "Beautiful spot, but we ended up having the biggest fight of our entire relationship here over absolutely nothing." Over time, the reviews took a darker, more specific turn. Multiple couples reported the same bizarre sequence of events. A perfectly pleasant first day would give way to a sudden, overwhelming sense of mistrust and resentment on the second evening. They would find themselves arguing over inconsequential things, the way one chewed their food, a forgotten item from the grocery list, a tone of voice that was perceived as a slight. These weren't simple disagreements. Guests described them as explosive, vitriolic fights that seemed to come from nowhere, fueled by an anger that felt foreign and uncontrollable. One woman wrote that she watched her fiancé of 5 years, the most gentle man she had ever known, suddenly slam his fist on the wooden dinner table hard enough to crack the plate between them, his face contorted with a rage she did not recognize. Another couple, high school sweethearts celebrating their 20th anniversary, confessed they spent their final night in the cabin sleeping in separate rooms and had begun divorce proceedings within a month of returning home. The host, initially skeptical, could no longer ignore the pattern. Something within those 4 walls was acting as a poison, a psychological accelerant poured onto the smallest embers of doubt. A guest with a particular interest in local folklore decided to do some digging and discovered the property's tragic backstory. The land, according to town records from the late 18th century, was once home to a solitary woman named Elena. Shunned by the community for her unconventional ways and her knowledge of herbal remedies, she was labeled a witch. Her only solace was a deep, abiding love for a local woodsman who would secretly visit her cabin. When he eventually bowed to town pressure and married a woman from a respectable family, Elena's heartbreak was absolute. On the night of his wedding, legend says she stood on the porch of her cabin and screamed a curse into the wind, not of death or disease, but of perpetual sorrow. She swore that no couple who found happiness on her land would ever keep it, that their love would curdle into ash and bitterness just as hers had. She was found the next morning, having taken her own life, and the property was left to decay for over a century. Those who have felt the cabin's influence describe a very specific sensation. It begins as a creeping coldness that has nothing to do with the temperature, a chill that seems to settle directly behind the heart. This is followed by a relentless, whispering voice in the back of the mind, not an audible sound, but a pervasive thought stream that magnifies every insecurity and suspicion. He doesn't really love you, she's hiding something, you're not good enough, they're laughing at you. It preys on the inherent vulnerabilities present in any relationship, turning tiny cracks into catastrophic fissures. The cabin doesn't create new problems, it weaponizes the ones that are already there, feeding them with the spectral energy of a woman's eternal, heartbroken rage. This final story brings our journey to a close not with a jump scare, but with a profound and unsettling question about the nature of hauntings. We've encountered places stained by violence, by neglect, by fear. But this Vermont cabin suggests a haunting can be far more precise and insidious. It is a monument to a very specific, deeply human emotion, vengeful heartbreak. It is a reminder that the echoes of the past are not always shouts or screams. Sometimes they are a silent, venomous whisper, a curse that doesn't break bones, but breaks something far more fragile. The bonds that hold two people together, proving that some wounds never heal, and some pain is so powerful it can outlast death itself, forever seeking company in its misery. From the spectral residue of a civil war soldier's sorrow to the chillingly modern violation of a hidden camera in a smoke detector, from the bizarre time loop of a 1950s themed cottage to the heartbreakingly curated shrine of a grieving host, our journey through 31 of the strangest Airbnb stories across the United States has been a masterclass in the unexpected. We've navigated through psychological experiments orchestrated by live-in hosts, stumbled upon fortified doomsday bunkers, and even borne witness to a phantom carnival forever replaying its final joyful night. Each story, in its own unique way, peels back the comfortable, predictable veneer of modern travel to reveal something far more raw and unpredictable lurking just beneath the surface. These narratives collectively underscore a profound and slightly unsettling truth about our new world of hospitality. A 5-star rating and a portfolio of pristine photos are not always a guarantee of a normal experience. They remind us that when we unlock a stranger's door, we are not just renting a space for a few nights. We are temporarily stepping into the ongoing story of a place and the people connected to it. That story can be haunted by history, twisted by obsession, punctuated by bizarre hobbies, or fractured by personal tragedy. The very platforms designed to build trust and facilitate easy travel can, in these rare and extreme instances, become the gateway to situations that feel anything but safe or simple. This isn't to say that every booking is a potential horror story, far from it. But these 31 accounts serve as a powerful reminder to travel with both an open mind and a healthy sense of awareness. They encourage us to look a little closer at those reviews, to listen to our instincts when something feels off, and to remember that the most memorable adventures are often the ones we never could have planned for. The world is a weird and wonderful place, and sometimes that weirdness is waiting for you just on the other side of a lockbox. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever checked into a rental that turned out to be far more than you bargained for? Did you discover a hidden room, a bizarre collection, or a host with a truly unforgettable story? Share your own strange travel tales in the comments below. Let's see if together we can uncover even more of the unbelievable stories hidden in plain sight. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the bizarre side of travel, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more explorations into the strange, the unexplained, and the fascinating facts about our world. Until next time, happy travels, and maybe do a quick check of the smoke detectors before you settle in.